I'm in a situation right now that I can't quite wrap my head around, and honestly, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. Let me start from the beginning. It was 5 years ago when my next-door neighbor, Charlie, well, Charles as everyone calls him, came over to tell us that his 14-year-old son had disappeared. He'd gone to the police, filed the report, and before long, the boy's face was on the news, plastered across missing posters all over town. Everyone knew. My wife and I felt awful. We couldn't imagine the kind of pain they were going through, and we offered to help them however we could, even if it was something small like watching their place or bringing them food when they were too drained to cook. Time kept moving, though. Months turned into years, and still there was no word about their son. No sightings, no calls, nothing. We assumed, though we never said it out loud, that at some point they must have accepted the reality, the worst reality a parent could ever face. We never found the courage to ask them directly if a body had ever turned up somewhere. It felt too cruel, too final to put into words. Every now and then, Charles and his wife, Kathy, would invite us over for a barbecue during the warmer months. It became a sort of ritual, but it was clear that neither of them had ever really been the same since the day their son vanished. Kathy, who used to have this warm, easy laugh, had grown quiet. Her eyes always distant, like she was somewhere else, someplace far away, where maybe her son was still with her. Charles, on the other hand, had developed this awkward, restless energy, always shifting from foot to foot, his smile tight and unsteady whenever he tried to make small talk. We understood, at least as much as anyone who hasn't lived through something like that could understand. How could anyone ever be the same after losing a child like that? After waking up every morning not knowing if he was out there somewhere, scared and alone, or if he was already gone. It was all understandable, at least to a certain extent. Fast forward a couple of years, and just last week, something strange happened. I was outside taking out the garbage when Charles walked over, catching me off guard. His eyes looked sunken, darker than usual, like he hadn't slept in days. He asked if he could borrow a shovel. I didn't even think twice about it. Without hesitation, I ran back inside and grabbed him my best shovel, not bothering to ask why he needed it. I handed it to him, and he mumbled a thank you, explaining he just needed to do some work in his backyard and would get it back to me by tomorrow. Before I could say much else, he turned around and disappeared through his gate. Later, when I was inside, I ended up walking past one of the upstairs windows that has a clear view into Charles's backyard. That was when I saw him. He was out there, digging. Not just a small patch for flowers or some quick repair. He was digging a huge hole in the ground, the dirt piling high around the edges as he struggled to lift each shovelful out. I could see from the way he paused and wiped the sweat from his brow that it was wearing him down. He's 56 after all, and he looked it in that moment, the shovel heavy in his hands, his shoulders slumped. Watching him, I felt a mix of concern and curiosity crawl up my spine. I figured maybe I'd go grab my second shovel and head over there to help him out. It didn't feel right to just watch him struggle like that. So I grabbed my other shovel, slipped into my shoes, and headed over to his backyard. The air felt heavy as I stepped through the gate, the smell of freshly turned earth mixing with the warm afternoon breeze. I called out his name, hoping not to startle him. But as soon as he heard me, he looked up sharply from where he was crouched in the dirt. His eyes were wide, startled, almost wild. He dropped my shovel so quickly it clattered against the edge of the hole, the metallic clang echoing unnaturally across the quiet yards. Then he hurried over to me, practically stumbling in his rush. "No, no, it's okay," he said, his voice rushed and strained, his hand waving me off like he was shooing away a stray animal. I blinked, taken aback. "What's wrong with you? It's not a big deal," I said, trying to brush off the tension that had suddenly wrapped around us like a cold draft. His reaction felt bizarre, sharp enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. But he just stared at me, breathing heavily, sweat glistening on his forehead. "I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard," he said, each word tense and deliberate, as if he were forcing himself to get the sentence out. Then he pointed at the gate, his hand shaking slightly, but the gesture was clear, like I was some dog he was ordering out of his yard. I stood there for a second, the awkward silence pressing down on me, his breathing loud in the heavy air. I didn't know what to say. I was so taken aback by how he was acting, by the cold insistence in his voice, that I just turned around and walked out without another word. I went upstairs, unable to shake the gnawing curiosity clawing at my mind, and positioned myself by the window to spy on him. From there, I had a clear view into his backyard. Charles was still at it, digging, the movements of his shoulders repetitive and strained as he heaved the dirt aside. He kept going like that for at least another half hour, the dirt forming uneven mounds around the edges of the pit. Finally, it looked like he was done. He dropped the shovel beside the hole, pausing with his hands on his knees as he caught his breath. Then, slowly, he started to look around, lifting his head to scan the neighboring houses, his eyes darting from one window to another, as if he was checking to see if anyone was watching him from above. Before I could think to duck down, his eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, we both froze. Him in his yard, under the pale light of the afternoon sky, and me at my window, the curtain half pulled aside. My heart lurched in my chest, but all I could do in that moment was casually step away from the window, pretending like I hadn't been watching him at all. But deep down, I knew it. He was up to something, and I needed to find out what. Over the next day, I kept checking his backyard whenever I had the chance, slipping quietly to the window and peeking through the blinds. But he wasn't digging anymore. The shovel lay untouched by the hole, and Charles himself was nowhere in sight. I figured he knew I had seen him now, and he would wait until it was dark before doing anything else. And I was exactly right. At 1:30 in the morning, I was lying in bed when I heard it, the sharp, metallic sound of a shovel slicing into dirt outside. The quiet of the night made the noise even clearer, each scrape of the metal against the earth ringing out like a whisper meant just for me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and moved to the window. But it was too dark now, the backyard nothing but a black void from up here, no matter how hard I squinted. So I decided to get a closer look. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept downstairs and unlocked the back door, stepping out into the cool night air. The scent of damp earth and summer grass filled my lungs as I carefully made my way to the fence, peeking over the top just enough to see. There he was, clear as day in the pale sliver of moonlight, digging again. The rhythmic crunch of the shovel biting into the dirt and the soft thud as he tossed it aside were loud in the night silence. He didn't look up this time, too focused on his task, his movements tense and determined. When he finally went back inside his house, I knew it was my only chance. I slipped over the fence, the wood creaking slightly under my weight, and dropped down into his backyard. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, and every rustle of the grass beneath my feet made me flinch as I approached the hole. I stopped at the edge, the dirt cool under my bare feet, and looked down. In the dim glow of the moon, I could see it, a small piece of a black garbage bag sticking out from the dirt at the bottom of the hole, barely visible, but impossible to ignore. I stood there, looking back and forth between his back door and the hole, my mind spinning, my breath shallow in the cold night air. I did this 3 more times, glancing nervously at the house, then down at that dark hole, debating with myself whether or not I should see what was in that bag. Every part of me wanted to know, to reach down and tear open that black plastic and confirm the fear clawing at the back of my mind. But in the end, instinct won over curiosity, and I decided to run. I slipped back over the fence and darted across my yard, the grass wet against my feet, the pounding of my heartbeat so loud it felt like it echoed in the darkness. It turned out to be the right decision, because just seconds after I slipped back into my yard, I saw Charles coming back outside. But he wasn't digging. I watched from the shadows as he moved quietly, disappearing to the other side of his house. He didn't come back, and I didn't dare step outside again to see where he had gone. I crept back into the house, closing the door softly so it wouldn't make a sound, and tiptoed upstairs, slipping back into bed beside my wife as quietly as I could. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to her soft breathing as I tried to steady my own, careful not to wake her. But sleep wouldn't come, not with the image of that black bag burned into my mind. The next morning, as soon as I woke up, I went straight to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out across into Charles's backyard. The hole was gone. The entire patch of ground where it had been was covered up now, the dirt smoothed out and tamped down as if it had never been disturbed at all. But that wasn't the only thing that caught my attention. His SUV, which he always parked in his driveway, was now parked out on the street. It sat there like a silent, waiting animal, and I couldn't stop the uneasy feeling that settled deep in my chest as I stared at it. I don't know what happened during the rest of that night, and the not knowing is eating away at me. But I can't shake the thought that what was at the bottom of that hole, hidden inside that black garbage bag, might have been his son's body all along. For all I know, he dug up whatever had been buried there for years and drove it somewhere else to dump it under the cover of darkness. Of course, this is all speculation. You can call me crazy if you want. I haven't told anyone about any of this, not even my wife. I just don't know what to do, and the fear that keeps creeping into my thoughts is starting to make it hard to think straight. And Charles? He never gave me back my shovel. I'm not going to ask him for it. I don't even want it back. Ever since that night, he's been avoiding me, barely even glancing in my direction when we happened to cross paths outside. And then, something happened yesterday that left me feeling cold and shaken for the rest of the day. By pure coincidence, I happened to look out my window across to Charles's house. That's when I saw him, standing there at one of his windows, staring directly into mine. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the daylight filtering in around him, outlining the shape of his head and shoulders, his face shadowed but unmistakably turned toward me. And then, without any expression, he reached up and shut the blinds, cutting off the connection in an instant. That was in the middle of the day. I don't know what to do. I really don't. But I can tell you this much. I'm honestly terrified. I've lived in 3 houses so far in my life, 2 with my family, and the one I'm in now by myself. We spent the first 15 years of my life in our first house, then moved to the second one for the next 7 years before I eventually moved out and found my current place. This experience happened during those last few months we were still in that first house, when I was 15. Thinking back, I don't remember my family ever being particularly friendly with the neighbors. We weren't rude, just distant. We kept to ourselves, and so did most of the people around us. Next door, there were 2 kids who lived with their dad, but even though they were right there, me and my brother had only talked to them once or twice our entire lives. It's strange, looking back on how little we knew about people who lived just a few feet away from us. Still, we knew their names, Eric and Todd. One day, me and my little brother, who was 5 years younger than me, were outside on the driveway, shooting hoops. It was one of those clear afternoons, the sound of the basketball bouncing against the concrete echoing down the street. That was when the screen door next door creaked open and one of the boys, Todd, stepped outside. He started walking over, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, his eyes squinting a bit against the sun. He initiated the conversation, catching us a little off guard. I can't remember exactly what we said back and forth, word for word, but I do remember the first thing he asked us. He wanted to know if it was true that we were moving. As the older brother, I did most of the talking, answering his questions while my little brother dribbled the ball off to the side, glancing over curiously but letting me handle it. Todd looked like he was probably around the same age as me, though I never actually asked, and he didn't mention it either. By the end of the conversation, Todd invited me to come with him and his brother Eric to shoot BB guns by the river in the woods down the road the next day. The way he said it was casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world. But there was something about the way he looked at me that made it feel like it was important to him that I came along. I agreed. It was the weekend, and I didn't have anything else going on anyway. It felt like it could be fun, something to do before we left that old house for good. At the last second, my little brother, bouncing the basketball with a hopeful look on his face, asked if he could come too. He didn't assume he was automatically invited. He was careful about it, glancing between me and Todd, waiting for an answer. Todd paused, then gave a small shrug and said, "Yeah," before turning around and walking back toward his house, leaving us there in the driveway, the basketball bouncing softly against the concrete as the sun dipped a little lower in the sky. Late the next day, about an hour before dusk, the doorbell rang. It was Eric and Todd. Me and my brother were quick to answer it, mostly because we didn't want our parents to find out we were sneaking out to shoot BB guns with the neighbors. We slipped out quietly, pulling the door shut behind us, our footsteps light on the porch as we followed Eric and Todd down the sidewalk. Walking with them was strange. Todd and Eric were decked out in full camo gear, head to toe, like they were heading off to a real mission, not just a casual afternoon by the river. Todd was carrying a big, worn duffel bag that clanked softly with each step, the weight of whatever was inside shifting as he moved. Me and my brother kept catching each other's eyes as we walked, trying to stifle the laughter that bubbled up at how serious these two were about all of this. The way they moved, the way they glanced around like they were scouting for enemies, it all felt like a game they were taking way too seriously. We barely spoke a word as we made our way down the street, the late afternoon shadows growing longer around us as we got closer to the woods. The silence was only broken by the crunch of gravel under our shoes and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. When we reached the woods, it was quiet, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and river water. Todd dropped the duffel bag onto the ground with a dull thud and unzipped it, the metallic sound of the zipper echoing faintly in the stillness. Eric, without saying a word, walked over to a nearby tree, grabbed a low-hanging branch, and snapped it clean off. He tossed it into the river with an aggressive flick of his wrist, the splash loud in the quiet, making me and my brother flinch. This time, when me and my brother looked at each other, there wasn't any laughter left to hold back. There was something off about the way Eric had broken that branch, something that made it clear this wasn't just play for them. Todd started pulling a couple of guns from the bag, handing one to me and another to my brother. They were heavier than I expected, the cold metal unfamiliar and uncomfortable in my hands. That was when Todd dropped the bomb. He told us they weren't BB guns. They were real guns. For a moment, it didn't register. It felt like a bad joke, something he was saying to mess with us. But then Eric reached back into the bag, pulled out another gun, and before I could say anything, he started firing across the river, the gunshots cracking through the air, sharp and shocking against the quiet. That was when it hit me. He wasn't joking. I felt a surge of anger and confusion mix in my chest, the sound of the shots ringing in my ears as I turned toward my little brother, who was standing there frozen, holding the gun awkwardly in his small hands. I grabbed the gun from him, my fingers cold and shaking as I took it away, and I placed both guns back into the duffel bag, the metal clanking against each other as they settled. "We're not comfortable with this," I said, my voice tight, trying to sound calm even though my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "We have to leave." Eric stopped firing, lowering the gun slowly, and both he and Todd turned to look at us. Their expressions were strange, somewhere between anger and disappointment. Their eyes narrowed, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it was pressing down on us. As we turned to leave, walking back toward the street, one of them, though I couldn't tell which, yelled a curse word after us, the shout echoing through the trees, lingering in the cold air as we walked away. I'd always had a feeling that those two were bad news. The way they carried themselves, the seriousness that seemed too heavy for kids our age, it all felt off. But what happened by the river that day confirmed it for me. That night at dinner, I told my brother not to speak to them anymore, not even to look at them if we saw them outside, for the rest of the time we were living there. We both agreed, silently, that it was the right thing to do. At the dinner table, we mentioned to our parents that the boys next door were really weird kids, brushing it off as if it was just another neighborhood story. We didn't mention the guns. We didn't dare. I went to bed that night, thinking that was the end of it. I was wrong. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a cold breeze brushing against my face, making me shiver under the covers. It was the kind of chill that wakes you up fully, your skin prickling, your mind catching up to the darkness around you. I opened my eyes and realized my window was wide open, the curtains swaying gently, the moonlight spilling in across my floor. Before I could process why my window was open, I felt something hard press up against the back of my head as I lay there, looking out at the dark yard. A voice, low and soft, whispered from right behind me. Shh. It felt like the world stopped. Somehow, I didn't scream. I didn't jump. I don't know how, but I managed to stay still, every muscle in my body tense and frozen, my breath caught in my throat. It was like my mind understood exactly what was happening before I had the chance to panic. Then I heard Todd's voice, close enough that I could feel his breath against my ear. In a hushed whisper, he told me that if I ever told anybody, especially his dad, about the guns or what had happened at the river, he would come back and kill me and my entire family. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but somehow I managed to respond, my voice quiet and shaky, barely more than a breath. Okay. That was all I could get out. He pressed the barrel of the gun harder against the back of my head for a second, enough to make it clear he meant every word, before pulling it away. I could hear the soft rustle of him moving, and then he slipped back out through my window, disappearing into the darkness outside. After that night, everything changed. Every night for months after, as we got closer to the date we were supposed to move, I would catch either Todd or Eric at one of their windows across the way, staring into our house. Sometimes it was into my room, sometimes into my little brother's room. I would look up from whatever I was doing and see them standing there, their faces pale and blank in the window, watching. They didn't wave, they didn't blink. They just stood there, night after night, their eyes locked on us, never looking away. And the closer we got to moving day, the stranger their behavior became. It was like they knew the clock was ticking, like they were waiting for something. And every day we stayed, the tension grew heavier, wrapping around the house like a cold fog that never went away. Just a week before we were set to move, it escalated. It was around 1 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a sharp, loud crack against my window. For a split second, I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to understand what the sound was, before I realized a rock had been thrown at the glass. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window, shoving it open, the cold night air rushing in around me. My eyes darted across the dark yard, trying to see who was out there. That's when I saw him. Todd was standing there in the yard, looking up at me, his face barely visible under the moonlight. He was aiming a pistol up at my window, holding it steady, pointing it directly at me. In that moment, I was sure I was about to die. Without even thinking, I dove to the floor, hitting the ground hard, my breath knocking out of me as I waited for the sound of the gunshot that I was certain was coming. But it never came. Instead, I heard them, both Todd and Eric cracking up, their laughter ringing out in the stillness of the night. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from a harmless prank. It was sharp, cruel, echoing across the yard like something broken. Through the open window, I heard one of them, maybe Eric, call out, his voice dripping with mockery. Fucking retard. There were 2 other instances that week, in the final days before we moved, where they harassed either me or my brother. Sometimes it was small things, like seeing them standing across the street, just staring, or finding small rocks left on our porch in the morning. Other times it was worse, like the soft tapping on the windows at night, or the quiet laughter that would drift in through the vents when the house was silent. Every moment of those final days felt stretched thin, like a single wrong move would snap the fragile calm and bring everything crashing down. And honestly, when moving day finally came, I couldn't think of a more perfect time for us to leave. It felt like we had barely gotten out of there in time, the tension only lifting once we were miles away, driving toward a new place where we wouldn't have to look over our shoulders every day. After all these years, neither me nor my brother has told anyone about the boys or the threats they made. We've never brought it up to our parents, never mentioned it to friends, never spoken about it to each other again. All I know is those 2 boys were troubled, deeply, dangerously troubled. And it was a good thing we got out of there when we did. At the time I'm writing this, it's only been 2 weeks since it happened. I've always hated just about all of my neighbors. I'm fresh out of college, finally living on my own, but that freedom comes with a price. I'm stuck in a really shitty area, the only place where I can actually afford a house right now, so it's not like I can expect to have the ideal neighbors. On one side, I've got people who blast their music so loud it rattles the windows, the bass thumping late into the night, making it impossible to sleep. But it's the neighbors on the other side who are a different level of unsettling. They're easily the creepiest people I've ever met in my life. There are 2 of them living next door. One is a woman in her 60s, gray hair tied back in a messy bun, her clothes always rumpled and stained. She's not friendly at all, barely even looks at you when you pass her, and there's this vacant look in her eyes, like she's there but not really there. The other is a slightly younger woman, though not by much, who has some kind of severe mental disabilities. I have no idea what their relationship is, mother and daughter, sisters, caretaker and patient. Nothing about them has ever made that clear, and I've never had the courage or desire to ask. I spend a lot of time sitting on my front porch, trying to get some air after long days working from home, and it's not uncommon for me to look over and see them outside. The older woman is always holding on to the younger woman's arm, gripping it tight, trying to keep her in place as she has these loud, chaotic freak-out episodes. The younger woman will cross her arms tight over her chest, rocking back and forth so fast it almost looks unnatural. Her mouth open as she screams and makes these guttural noises that cut through the quiet of the neighborhood. Sometimes, in the middle of one of these episodes, she'll stop suddenly, her head snapping in my direction, and she'll point directly at me, her hand shaking as she mumbles something I can't understand to the older woman. It's disturbing. The way her eyes lock onto mine, the way she points and mumbles with this intense, almost desperate energy, it makes my skin crawl every single time. Sometimes, when it gets too uncomfortable, when the noises get too loud, or the way they look at me becomes too much, I just get up and go inside, closing the door behind me and trying to pretend I can't still hear her through the walls, trying not to think about the way she points and whispers my way, like she knows something about me that I don't. Anyway, it was a night like any other. I had to get to bed early since I needed to be up for work in the morning. I was already exhausted, hoping for a quiet night, but of course, that wasn't going to happen. The neighbors next door were making an unusual amount of noise. I could hear the deranged woman next door screaming, her voice high and broken, words turning into shrieks as she threw what sounded like a full-on fit. Over her screams, I could hear the older woman yelling in distress, her voice strained, trying to calm her down, or at least contain the chaos inside their walls. It went on like that for about an hour. The screaming, the crashing sounds, the occasional sharp bang against the wall. It was relentless, vibrating through the thin walls of my house, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on a jacket, stepped outside into the cold air, and marched over to the house next door, the screaming still going strong even as I walked up their front steps. I raised my hand and pounded on the door, the sound echoing through the neighborhood, briefly overpowering the chaos inside. After a moment, the door swung open, and the older woman stood there, her face twisted in irritation, her hair sticking out in wild tufts, her eyes sharp and angry under heavy lids. "What the hell do you want?" she snapped, her voice raw. I took a breath, trying to keep my voice steady, forcing as much calm into my words as I could. "Could you please keep the noise down?" I asked, my tone as polite as I could manage. In response, she raised her eyebrows, tilting her head down slightly as she glared at me, the annoyance radiating off her in waves. She didn't say a word, just let out a short, sharp breath, her lips curling in displeasure. Just then, the younger woman came stumbling into the living room, her arms flailing as she screamed over and over, "How dare you! How dare you! How dare you!" Her voice was piercing, each repetition hitting like a needle against my eardrums, the words blending into the same shriek of anger. She tried to push past the older woman toward me, her hands clawing at the air, her eyes wild and locked onto mine. The older woman grabbed her, wrapping her arms around her from behind, holding her back as she thrashed and screamed. Without saying another word, she shot me a final glare and slammed the door in my face, the force of it rattling the frame. I just stood there on the porch for a moment, the echo of the slammed door hanging in the cold night air. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't accomplish what I came there to do. Feeling defeated, I turned and walked back to my house, the sound of my footsteps crunching against the gravel as I made my way back inside. But when I got back to my room, I realized something. It was silent. They had finally gone quiet next door. No more screaming, no more crashing, no more shrieking voices cutting through the night. And for the first time that evening, I was able to get some sleep at last. Well, I woke up feeling like the night had passed in the blink of an eye, like I had barely closed my eyes before something pulled me back into the waking world. I turned my head, squinting at the glowing red numbers on my clock. 3 in the morning. I let my head fall back onto the pillow with a quiet sigh of relief, hoping I could drift back to sleep quickly. But as I lay there, eyes closed, I thought I could hear something coming from downstairs. It was faint, a soft noise, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight, or something brushing against the wall. I opened my eyes and listened, holding my breath to make sure I wasn't just imagining it. When it didn't stop, I slipped out of bed, the cold floor biting at my feet as I padded over to my bedroom door. I stood there for a moment, pressing my ear against the wood, straining to hear. But everything was silent now, the only sound the soft hum of the house around me. I waited another moment before letting out a quiet breath, shaking my head at myself and turning back toward my bed. I climbed back under the covers, pulling them up to my chest, willing myself to fall back asleep. But I woke up again. The room was still dark, the air heavy, and when I glanced at the clock, only 20 minutes had passed since I had last fallen asleep. I lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to understand what had woken me up this time. And then I heard it. A sound, soft, low, almost like a whisper, but not quite words, coming from somewhere in the room. Panic tightened in my chest as I scrambled to find my phone on the bedside table, my hands fumbling against the smooth surface until I finally felt it. But I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. Instead, I held it in my hand, gripping it tightly as I lay there, listening, my eyes scanning the dark room, trying to find the source of the sound. My breathing was shallow, loud in the silence as I strained to see, expecting at any moment to spot a dark figure standing in one of the corners, waiting, watching. I looked at every corner of the room, the darkness so thick it felt like it was pressing against my skin. But even then, I could tell there wasn't anybody standing there. And then I heard it again. This time, I knew where it was coming from. Slowly, I turned my head toward the edge of my bed, the wooden frame creaking softly as I shifted, peering down into the darkness. That's when I saw it. Right at the edge of the wooden wall of my bed, pressed up against it, was a black, shadowy, circular object. It wasn't moving, but it looked wrong, like it didn't belong there, like it was darker than the rest of the room, absorbing what little light there was, a spot of pure, unnatural blackness. When I finally worked up the nerve to lift my phone and let its screen light spill across the floor, the pale glow revealed what that black object really was. It was the face of the deranged woman from next door. Her face was inches from mine, twisted and wild, her eyes wide and glinting in the light, her hair hanging in tangled clumps around her face. For a split second, we just stared at each other, frozen in that beam of cold light. And then she screamed. It was a scream like nothing I've ever heard before, raw and shrill, the kind of scream that made the air in the room vibrate, the kind that felt like it cut straight into your skull. She screamed like the lunatic she was, like a wild animal cornered or a vampire burning under the light. And I screamed too. I screamed as I scrambled backward, fumbling for the edge of the bed, trying to get away, my feet getting tangled in the blankets. I fell to the floor, hitting the ground hard, pain shooting through my knee as I scrambled to get back up. I looked back as I crawled, my breath tearing out of me in gasps, just in time to see her crawling after me, her mouth open in another scream, her eyes locked onto me with a feral hunger. I managed to get to my feet, stumbling as I lunged for the door. I slammed it shut behind me, the sound echoing down the hallway as I twisted the lock with shaking hands. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time, nearly falling again as I rushed down to the first floor. I reached the door that led upstairs and slammed it shut, locking it just as I heard her pounding on the other side, her fists slamming against the wood, the sound hollow and terrifying. She was screaming again, but now it was nothing but a string of incomprehensible noises, loud and desperate, like she was trying to tear the door down with the force of her voice alone. I pulled out my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers, pressing it to my ear as I backed away from the door, every slam against it making me flinch. When the cops finally showed up, their lights flashing blue and red against the dark windows, I opened the door, my hands still trembling as I explained what had happened. I told them she was the neighbor, that she was mentally unstable, that she had broken into my house in the middle of the night. While I was talking to the officers, the older woman from next door came over, having heard all the commotion. She stepped into the light, her face tight with worry, as she pleaded with the officers, begging them to let the younger woman go, to let her take care of it, to just leave them alone. But the officers shook their heads. They told her they had to take the younger woman in, at least for the night, for everyone's safety. One of the officers turned to me, asking if I wanted to press charges. The moment he said it, I glanced at the older woman, and she was already looking at me. The look she gave me was pure venom. Her eyes were narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line, and the hate in her stare was so intense it made my chest tighten, like I couldn't breathe. It was a stare that said everything she wanted to say without a single word, a promise that this wasn't over. I swallowed hard and told the officer that I didn't want to press charges. But her stare didn't change. The officers led the younger woman out of my house, her head down, her hair hanging in front of her face as she shuffled forward, still mumbling under her breath. The older woman didn't say a word as she watched them put her into the car, her eyes never leaving me, following me even as she turned and walked back to her house. 5 minutes later, I watched from my window as she got into her car and drove away, disappearing down the street without a word. They still live next door. And now, every time I step outside, I can feel that hateful stare, like a weight pressing against my back, reminding me that I'm not wanted here, that they haven't forgotten what happened. I'm seriously considering moving out, because that creepy woman next door makes it clear she despises me, and it's obvious now that the younger woman isn't just unsettling, she's dangerous. And I'm not sure how much longer I can live next to them, waiting for the day she comes back.